You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is Season 2, Episode 12. Yes, Episode 12, which marks the end of Season 2. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like something to celebrate, especially since I never did celebrate the fact that this podcast has been going on for more than a year. I guess I'll just combine both of those things into one event, shall we? So I will be having a virtual party on Sunday, April 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that will be over on YouTube Live, so you can attend. Just go on over to the YouTube channel for Females in Fantasy. I also have a direct link to that in the show notes for this episode. And yeah, there'll be a Q&A session, just kind of like a live chat, and we'll hang out, and there may be even a certain world deity you'll get to meet, or maybe even two. So once again, that will be on Sunday, April 7th, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I hope to see you there. Moving on to today's episode, we'll be hearing from V.S. Holmes on the topic of disability in fiction. Specifically, we'll be talking about writing disabled characters in fantastical settings. Without further ado, here's my conversation with V. Welcome, V, to the Females in Fantasy podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for having me. This is sort of an exciting surprise.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. So as I always start the podcast, give us like the kind of rundown on who you are, how you first got into writing, some of the projects that have come out and things you're working on, all that.
So I'm a queer sci-fi fantasy author. That's my night job. My day job, I work as an archaeologist in northern New England. And what I've been working on lately has been my sci-fi series and my fantasy series. So the sci-fi series is the Nell Bentley books, and it's sort of near future sci-fi. It follows a female lesbian archaeologist as she navigates a little more sci-fi elements than she's used to. She hates sci-fi. That's like one of my favorite things about her character, because I'm throwing her into these worlds she hates. And then my fantasy series is Reforged, and the fourth and final book in that series comes out this fall, which is scary and awesome at the same time.
Yay.
And both of those worlds, I try to explore various diverse characters. And that's been sort of a fun thing to do. And let's see what else. Those are my main projects. The third in the sci-fi series is coming out in April. Also scary. And yeah, that's me, I guess. I live in New England, and I live in a tiny house. I have a dog. There's a fun anecdote, I guess. So.
Awesome. So we're going to talk today about disability in fantasy. And I want to start off just kind of like broadly, just like your personal opinion, just kind of what makes good disability rep in general. And then we'll go into like why that matters, but just kind of like a general, just breaking into this topic, like what are your kind of broad opinions on it?
Well, it's something we don't see very often at all. And I think we should see more of it. I have a connective tissue disorder and a heart issue. And that means that sometimes I look like a normal person, and sometimes
I've never met a normal person.
Right? I know everyone's always talks about these normal people. I haven't seen one yet, but I
very
walk
elusive
around.
Creatures.
And then some days, my bad days, I'm in so much pain I can't leave my bed, and that's something you don't see in a lot of books, especially in books that are more, they have either fantastical worlds or science fiction worlds or whatnot. And it's one of those tricky things that it's very easy to fall into that, well, they're disabled, but maybe for example, they're blind, but they can magically see. And that's not exactly what disability is about. And I would love to see more casual disability where it's oh, well, here's this main character, and they also happen to have this disability or this mental illness. And it's, it's connected obviously with who they are as a character, but it's not integral to their plot necessarily. Just like casually queer characters, oh, they happen to have this orientation, or they happen to be trans or whatever.
Yeah. So why does this matter? And just to kind of explain a little bit here, I feel like some listeners might be a little bit resistant to having another representation category, so to speak, and they may be questioning, they don't really see why disability should be on par with, say, race or gender or sexuality. So what would you say to someone like that? What's the benefit of having that kind of positive visibility for disabilities? That rhymed.
Yeah. Well, usually when someone is having a little bit of resistance to a representation. I like to start out with, I'm really happy that you've been able to see yourself in fiction. That must be really wonderful. However, a lot of us can't. And I remember very distinctly the first time I saw a character that looked like me and acted like me in a book. And I was like 12 or 13. And that was the first time I was like, oh, whoa, like people want to hear about people like me. And, people who aren't just me want to hear about people like me. And that's something that's so valuable. And it really opens your mind as a reader or, a viewer, whatever medium you're digesting. It helps you realize like, oh, I can do things, especially when you're talking to like a younger generation. It's very easy to think that you're boxed into this one way of life when you're not told from a very young age that you can. And I think that that's incredibly valuable because so many people, able, disabled, any marginalization, we all have so many good stories that we need to share that are important and, such value to society. But if we're told that no one wants to hear them, then we're not going to tell them. And I think that it makes the world a richer place when we have as much representation, as many different people as possible, whether that's, queer, different races, different backgrounds, different religions and abilities.
Yeah. And there's something that I think about, some people that have been speaking about this have drawn my attention to it. That's a better way to put it. And that is, there's the kind of a trope with it happens both with disabled and with mentally ill characters. And they're very often either the villains or the victims and very rarely seen as heroes. And it's interesting because we have to ask the question, what does that do to a society when we kind of as a whole internalize the idea that people like that are villains and or victims? Yeah, I'm going to just let you speak on it and then I'll add my own thoughts. But
well, it's definitely something that, I think this is true with a lot of different representations where people are like, oh, well, it's not realistic, especially in a fantasy setting when it's like, oh, well, it's not historically accurate. It's like, what really is history? How accurate are the histories we're reading when we get down to it? And it's something that's so ingrained, I think, in that symbolism. Even if you think back to both the myth and now the more modern superhero version of Odin and Thor and losing this eye and becoming partially blind for wisdom. There's a lot of symbolism, even if they're not villains or victims, if they're a side character, because like you pointed out, they're never heroes, right? They have this symbolizing attribute that's not really the disability itself. It's like this sort of magical thing, or they have like second sight, which sort of goes hand in hand with wisdom. And I remember I was so excited to see the new Wonder Woman movie, and for like 1,000 different reasons. And I was so excited. And then I had seen little clips of this female character who was disfigured. And I was like, oh, that's really neat character. I'm so glad that they're incorporating her. And then I watched the movie. Spoilers, it's been out for a while. And she's the villain. And while I do think it's awesome to have female villains, because that's another thing we don't see very often is fleshed out female villains, it was like, oh, but it's the woman with the disfigured face. And it's just so frustrating to see that. It's very, very easy to internalize that. And that's something that I've struggled with because like I'm pretty new in my like not being able to do the things I used to be able to do. And the stuff I've had to unpack in my own head that I've internalized is like, oh, well, I'm not desirable, or, oh, I'm not interesting, or, oh, I can't do all these things, so I'm not as much of a human. And it's like, whoa. I would never say that about someone else, but because those are the characters that I've read about who look like me or act like me or have the same abilities as me or lack thereof. That's all I've been told. And, as an adult human, I can unpack that to some extent with varying degrees of success, depending on the day. But if I were a child or if I were someone who, wasn't able to do that to the same degree, it's incredibly debilitating.
Yeah. And there's another side of this too, where I feel like, so like a lot of thrillers in particular, I think thrillers and like horror movies are kind of guilty of the like someone that has some sort of a mental or physical disability as they kind of make it into something scary. And I've observed that I really do think that has affected the kind of general cultural consciousness where certain like there have been associations with mental illness and bad character to the point where, when people are talking about politics and they're talking about a politician or someone, or, a school shooter or someone that does something really evil, that one of the first things they want to reach for is that they're mentally ill, which is really disturbing because it's like, well, one, that's avoiding the problem, the real problem, which is that human beings are capable of evil. And we need to be able to really address that head on and not kind of close our eyes to that. So I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance where people don't really want to see the potential for evil in themselves. But then also it like puts potentially vulnerable people at risk, because especially people with like different mental illnesses or disabilities, there are and I think also physical disabilities. I'm not totally sure about the stats, maybe, but they are far more likely to be on the receiving end of violence than to be perpetuating it. And often that is because of their disability. And so it's like, there's some real dangerous, real world consequences to us having this association that like, oh, this person doesn't look quote unquote normal, or they don't act quote unquote normal. Their brain works differently than I do. Therefore, they are scary. Therefore, they have like there's a moral problem with them. That's so disturbing, not just untrue, but, I think that has real influences on the world.
For sure. And I think in a lot of cases, I mean, there's the mental illness stigma for sure. And it's so easy to be like, oh, they're crazy. And even in writing, like as I've been revising my work, it's like, oh, I used to say that, and that's probably not something I should say. And it just takes a few seconds of effort, but it's definitely something that you have to consciously think of until it becomes natural. And it's the whole mental illness stigma, and especially like you were saying with, being more vulnerable to violence. There's the societal violence, but then there's also just the, you're more vulnerable to accidents, things like that, because you don't have the resources you need to, or, people aren't going to be looking out for you because they're looking out for themselves. And they're like, you're something else. I'm not going to help you. And you see it with homeless folk all the time. If they're not acting normal, again with that word, then people aren't going to want to reach out and help them as much, and which is really too bad, because a lot of it's just resources. They're a totally real human being. They just they need a different type of help, and they're not able to get that.
Yeah, for whatever reason, whatever safety nets that they should have had in society fell through. And they didn't have someone that was there for them. And so it's like, it's not because they did something wrong.
And there's this argument too, I was remembering, where it's like, oh, well, it's human instinct to be afraid of something that you don't understand. It's like, okay, yeah, but I think we're a little beyond human instinct as a society at this point. I mean, for God's sakes, we fly in the air. I think we can take a few seconds to overcome that instinct, and also just be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Be like, okay, this is a different experience. And talking to this person is different. I'm not sure how they communicate, or it's, I'm afraid I'm not going to communicate myself well. And that's hard. That's a hard thing to do. But I think being able to sort of sit with that uncomfortableness and be like, okay, well, this is a learning experience. And I think for the most part, unless if you're being an outright bigot, people will try and accommodate you and be like, okay, well, like, this is new for you, and that's fine as long as you're being respectful and, you're not being weird about it. That we can have this be a learning experience, which is great. And that's something that the internet is really great about, because it sort of takes down some of those barriers for learning and for getting words out.
Yeah. And the thing about like something being natural, it's like that is technically true. So I guess there's kind of an uncomfortable but worthwhile to mention thing about this is that sometimes that fear that people have, people with disabilities or with really any sort of illness, part of that is natural, but it's also like society isn't natural. So you got to remember, most of the good things that we have about the way that we organize ourselves culturally and socially are not natural. These are things we kind of made up in the last like 10,000 years or less. And in order to make this work and to make it a better world, we have to go beyond just what is an instinct. Certain things that, whatever may have been useful when we were like hunter-gatherers or whatever. And just because something was useful in the sense of survival still doesn't mean that it's good. It still means that there may have been a lot of pain involved in that too. So it's not like just because it's a fallacy to say that because something is natural, it's morally good, right? Or it's morally, or that it's true in a sense. It's like, it's kind of an excuse. It's like, if there is that kind of an instinct really to be more mature as a person, you've got to go beyond that. You've got to be able to think about things for yourself and not just, you don't just give in to every single instinct you ever have either. Like we resist that kind of thing all the time.
Yeah.
That's part of being a fully mature human being, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I really want to punch that guy in the face, but I could lose my face.
Perfect example. Yeah. We have instincts. We have desires to enact violence all the time. And we most of the time don't do it. There are reasons for that. Okay. I'm going to move on to a patron question. This is from Brennan. So she says, I am preparing to write a fantasy novel with a protagonist who has oh God, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right. Paraplegia, due to a spinal injury. There's no magic in the world, so she's going to need a very adaptable wheelchair to navigate the forest where most of the story takes place. Do you have any advice for writing a physically disabled protagonist?
Yes. So I recently wrote a deaf protagonist. Now I'm a hearing person, and my dad is deaf, but he doesn't use sign language, and he sort of just it's not something he's lived with for his whole life. It's sort of an age-related thing. So it was something that was very new to me, and I wanted, like Brennan, to do it well and do it in a respectful manner and a realistic manner. And realistic as far as existing as a deaf person, not realistic as far as fantasy goes, because it's fantasy, guys. And I found listening to people in the community and hiring a sensitivity reader, more than one if you can, because everyone's experience is different. That really helped me. And I know very rudimentary sign language. So I sort of understood the differences between, spoken conversation and signed conversation. And I did understand that, but I didn't understand a lot of the nuances and, how exhausting certain things were. And hiring a sensitivity reader was it improved my writing, both, when writing a deaf character and not. And it's totally worth the investment. Definitely do it. And also, just listen to people and think about, start noticing things about your own surroundings. There's a really good article called Staircases in Space, I think along those lines, by Ace Ratcliffe. And it's about the science fiction genre, but it's sort of the same thing, especially if your character is paraplegic. Think about how many staircases you encounter every day, and just sort of engage with your environment with that in the back of your head, and start noticing okay, is she going to be able to get up those stairs? And that doesn't mean necessarily make your world completely accessible to her. Maybe that depends on your world and the cultures that she's encountering, but think about, okay, if this isn't accessible to her, how is she going to overcome it, and what kind of things you can work into the world. And remember, it is fantasy. Just because you've read books that, all have similar looking worlds doesn't mean yours has to be the same. It's literally up to you. So, yeah. And also encounter some of, talk to people, don't maybe badger people for information, but see if you can find other books, whether in their fantasy genre or not, that have dealt with characters who are in a wheelchair or, whatever sort of adaptive devices she uses, and see how they navigate through their world.
That's good advice. I want to ask you one thing. At what point in that process did you hire sensitivity readers? Did you do any to help you with the concept earlier, or just did you wait until the end to see if your research was good? What did you do for that?
So it was sort of like the beta reader stage. I had edited it, revised it myself, and I'd definitely gone through. It's sort of an interesting thing because I wrote the book years ago, and then when I rewrote it, I realized that the character was deaf. So when I first wrote her, she was a hearing person. Then as I was rewriting it, I'm like, actually, no, she's not. And then sort of I did what I could. I listened to people. I read articles. I sort of learned a little bit more than I already knew about ASL, though obviously she doesn't use ASL because, I guess they speak English, but not really because it's fantasy world. But I did some of my homework. And then when it got to the point where it's I don't know, then I sent it off to a sensitivity reader. And I found my sensitivity reader on Twitter. Twitter is an awesome resource for listening to people of various experiences, whether it's, again, race or sexuality or whatever, definitely as much of a cesspool as it can be.
Twitter is a give and take. It's a bunch of shitty stuff and then some great stuff too. It's I can't leave even though I want to.
Just like the real world.
So let's talk. Oh.
No,
except not. Very specific kinds of useful and toxic things that happen there that are disproportionate. But anyway, so fantasy worlds with magic. This was one of the specific things that you told me that you wanted to talk about. when it comes to disability? Like, what irks you? What do you wish to see differently? Just kind of like tell me about your opinions on that topic.
So much of it is the magical cure that it just is so frustrating. And I even there was a point in my book where I almost did this myself just because it's something I'm so used to seeing. And then it's like, whoa, 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 stop. And to be fair, you can do almost anything well and respectfully if you really try. But this is one of those things where it's like, I'm tired of seeing it. And a lot of it has to do with at the end, the character and whatever their disability happens to be, they've done the thing, they've saved the world, they've, fixed whatever needed fixing. And then because of this magical whatever that happened, oh, look, but now they're cured though. And that's a fun bonus. It's like, well, is it? Because they saved the world with a disability. Do they really suddenly need to be fixed? And this is a hard one because, while a lot of disabled people are trying to find things that make life easier for them, that doesn't necessarily translate to, I want it to be gone. And I think, the more you talk to people of various, abilities, you're going to realize that there is this gradient. And some people do want to be cured, so to speak, and some people don't. And that's something you have to sort of go inside of yourself and figure out for your character. But especially if you're an abled person, I would sort of maybe veer away from using this magical cure or a divine cure. That's another common one, is as a reward for their services, the gods have bestowed upon them, a lack of a disability now. And it sends this message that disability is only something to be cured, and you can only be happy and a functional member of society when you are fully abled. And that's one of the things I've had a really hard time unpacking myself, is oh, well, but I'm not that whole I'm subhuman. I'm not human if I can't, climb the trees I used to climb as a kid. It's well, okay, but that's not true. And it's so easy in a world where magic is so integral to the genre. It's so easy to just magically cure people, but you can give people magical assistive devices. Magical, it's easier in sci-fi because you have hover chairs and things, but you can have devices that help the character and make life easier for them, just like in our world, but that don't just poof, you're better. And yeah, that's most of it. My mom recently asked me, she's if you could do things differently, if you could go back and not have, this diagnosis, would you? And I immediately answered, no, I'm fine this way. Yeah, it sucks, but I'm fine. And I didn't realize that was my answer until she asked me that question. And it is hard. It's not a fun time, but I've also learned so much about who I am as a person that I wouldn't want to make that trade. And I think that's something you have to think about with your characters, is they've lived their whole life this way, maybe or maybe not, depending on their plot line. But do you really want to take that away from them?
Man, this has been one of those cases where I kind of wish that I hadn't committed to doing a short podcast, because there's so much more, there's so much more about this. I'm going to just have to, maybe I'll ask you later if you have recommendations for more people that I can invite on, because sure. There's so, it's just I knew we were going to just be really, really broad, but
I know,
I still didn't, I still didn't get to everything I wanted to say. So that means I need more episodes on this. But yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Please let everyone know how they can follow you, keep up with your work, all that stuff.
Yeah. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, VS_Holmes in most places. And you'll see my ginger hair. It's kind of distinctive. I'm also, my website is vsholmes.com. And I'm on social media a lot. I'm not necessarily posting on social media a lot. I've got that lurker thing going on. And I also run a podcast myself with our company. You'll see her on there soon. So yeah, just Facebook stalk me nicely. And I'm definitely most active on Twitter and Instagram currently, because I'm a millennial and Facebook is awful. And my
not going to argue with that.
And my books are available in paperback and wherever digital books are sold. So if you want to check it out.
Awesome. Again, as I always say, I will include links to all that in case people missed any of the details. But yeah, thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me.
That was my conversation with V. Or at least it was one of my conversations with her. I actually did an interview over on her podcast as well. So if you want to listen to that, head on over to the Amphibian Press podcast. I've included a link to it in the show notes. And if that hasn't come up yet, it will in a day or two. As this is the end of season 2 of the Females in Fantasy podcast, I'm going to be taking a brief break, and I will be coming back with season 3 on May 9th. And I'm pretty excited about season 3. I've got a number of conversations already recorded, including some that cover some controversial topics. Probably the most controversial topic that we're covering is going to be the very first episode. So y'all get to look forward to that. Be sure to mark your calendars for April 7th. For the virtual party. I hope to see you all there. And as always, special shout out to Brandon, my top patron and the world deity of the Females in Fantasy podcast. All hail. This has been the Females in Fantasy podcast. I am Brianna Da Silva, and I'll catch you all on May 9th. Thanks for listening.